You should see my screen now, and let me switch over to Keynote. Excellent. Again, welcome. We're going to be spending the next couple hours learning about the advanced usage of AG-Grid. My name is Brian Love, and I'm going to be your tour guide for the next 3 hours. I'm a Google developer expert in Angular and web technologies, and I really enjoy traveling. And so here's a picture of myself on the left. I did a hike to the top of, I might mess up the pronunciation. It's in Norway called Prerequisites, which is a beautiful lookout over a fjord. This is my wife and I in the top right in Spain from last fall when we were traveling. And I'm currently, as I mentioned earlier, residing in Portland, Oregon in the United States. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is certainly learning and teaching and being a part of that, but I'm really passionate about a concept called learn in public. And I want to just share this with you here at the beginning before we get started. I really like the idea of learning in public. While you can certainly learn, and I think as technologists, we're learning constantly, and you can kind of learn and keep it to yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that by any means. In order to get your job done or to learn a new skill or new language or new framework. But I think that there's a real unique advantage and an opportunity to do what I call learning in public. And learning in public can look like a lot of different ways for different people. This can look like maybe speaking or being a part of a meetup group or blogging, writing a book, whatever it is. But I wanted to come up with a way to make it easy. And so I built this website and an application in Angular called lookout.dev. And the goal is to make it easy to learn in public. So it's free, you can sign up, and it's really easy to go in and share that you've learned something. For example, Alex Okrushko, who works for Google, just shared something today that was really cool that I learned from him just by reading it in terms of improved typing around extracting keys and properties from objects in enums. And so that was really cool that he shared that with us. I would not have known that. And so if you learn something today and you want to share it, you don't have to, but this is an easy way to do so. And so you sign in and then you can share your knowledge, what I call a lookout, and you just add a quick description about what you learned. You can add some instructions around maybe things to do, things to avoid, things to consider, and why. And then you can have some code snippets at the bottom. You can have some examples of maybe what not to do, or you might have examples of what to do. And so it's a really easy way to learn in public. Check it out if you want to learn more. It's at lookout.dev. Jason already kicked us off with some housekeeping, but I want to add a little bit more to that. Of course, I want to reiterate the code of conduct. Jason already did a good job spelling that out for us. Just want to make sure that we double reinforce that. We are going to run this workshop on Mountain Standard Time. So I am currently in Pacific Standard Time in the United States. So it is 1:09 p.m. on my clock. We're going to run this workshop from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Of course, that's not everybody's Mountain Standard Time, but we're going to kind of sync up on that. So, so we'll be with each other for the next 3 hours. I'm going to try to give you a brain break or a bio break, if you will, every hour. If you need to step away, of course, do so. But I'm going to try to build in, at least 5 or 10 minutes that you can step away and take a break and go for a walk or stretch or whatever it is that you need to do. If you have any questions, certainly raise your hand or use the Q&A panel is the best way, actually. So if you, in Zoom, I think down at the bottom of your screen, if you hit Q&A, you'll be able to put in an answer, and I will diligently go through and provide answers to all of your questions. Real quick, some prerequisites to get started with. You need to know JavaScript and TypeScript because we're going to be doing some advanced things here. You also need to have fundamentals of Angular knowledge and RxJS. And hopefully, if you either attended the AG-Grid session this morning or you're already using AG-Grid, that's going to make for a really better experience as you do the exercises and follow along. So hopefully you've got some knowledge about AG-Grid fundamentals. Here's what you can expect from me for the next 3 hours. I'm going to teach you something. I'm going to show you some code. I'm going to walk through a demo. I'm going to show you a demo in the browser using the demo application. And then I'm going to give you an exercise. I'll give you a few minutes to work through that exercise. I've given you instructions in the exercise and instructions in the actual code sandbox. So we're going to be using code sandbox.io for you to do those exercises. And then we'll go ahead and we will work through the solution together. So I'll actually go through the solution and type it up for you and reiterate that learning knowledge. So the agenda for today, and I'm actually going to reorder this real briefly, but we're going to start out with immutable data. And so this works very well with NgRx. You don't have to be using NgRx, and I've written all of the NgRx for you. So if you're afraid of it, or you've never used it, or you're using something else, and when I say afraid, if it's just not you don't want to get into NgRx, that's fine. The only reason why we're going to be using NgRx is NgRx provides one of the key concepts of NgRx and Redux in general is the idea of immutable data. And we're going to be using immutable data in order to update, add, and remove data in our grid with ngGrid. And so again, I've already written the NgRx for you. If you're using another solution for state management in Angular, Kita, MobX, ngXS, or maybe a hand-rolled solution, this would still apply. We're then going to take a look at styling ngGrid. Actually, I'm going to reorder this because I want to get into the custom cell render stuff right off the bat. And I want to make sure that we get through the timing on this. This morning's ended up perfect with the timing. We got right through all of it at the very end, but I'm not entirely confident on the timing here. So I want to make sure that we do this first. So after immutable data, we're going to jump into the cell renderers. And this is the exciting part, honestly, I think for all of us. We're going to be using custom Angular components in order to extend the functionality of ngGrid. And we're going to be doing that with cell rendering, filtering, and editing. And so this is going to be a really exciting part of the story for this afternoon. And then we're going to get into styling ngGrid and cell editing. We may do cell editing first. We'll see how this kind of goes. I'm pulling a last minute change here. But the styling section is certainly good, but it's perhaps not as advanced as maybe I think some of you might be looking for. And so that's around theming and customizing the look and feel of ngGrid. As was mentioned, we're going to be using a demo application in order to go through some of the demos and some of the teaching. So if you haven't done so, go over to the demo application. So let me fix this. This is clone. So go ahead and clone out the repository. Jason has already put a link in the chat for you. So go over here and clone out this repository. Once you clone out the repository, you're going to see an Angular directory. You need to go in there. And then once you're in the Angular directory, run the npm install command. And then, of course, at the end of that, run the npm start command. When you do so, you should see the demo application. Go ahead and open it up in your browser. And it should look like this. We've got a whole bunch of demos here on the right. And then we're going to look at those on the right. The links on the left and then the demos on the right. So we've got, for example, here's like a default editor where I can edit values. And so we're going to be working through some of this demos in the application together. So make sure you go ahead and grab that if you haven't already. It's a great opportunity to kind of follow along with the demos and get to play with it. With that said, let's dive right in. Let me make sure I don't have any questions. Okay, good. Let's talk about immutable data. Let me real quickly mention, these pictures are all mine. I should have mentioned this in the morning session. These pictures are all mine from traveling last year. So I think I'm going in reverse order of my travel journey. So I think we're going to start in Spain, and then we're going to get up into the Baltics with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. There'll be some pictures from Austria and Germany. And then I don't know if I made it on my pictures all the way to Norway. We'll see. But you got to follow along on our journey. So we are currently in Spain on our pictures on the right. So let's talk about immutable data and some of the advantages. So one of the advantages is we can synchronize data with a store, right? So if I've got data in my store, if I've got NgRx or Kita, MobX, ngXS, and I've got data in a store, it's really great that I can leverage this immutable data with ngGrid in order to synchronize the data between the store and my grid. So the grid state is maintained, and this is a really big advantage of immutable data versus some of the other methodologies for updating data in ngGrid. For example, in ngGrid, you can bind to the row data property and set row data in through a row data object, whether that's maybe asynchronous with an observable. You can use the grid API to set row data. But what you're going to see is that the grid state is not maintained when you set new row data in. And what I mean by grid state is I'm talking about things like selected rows and columns, filters, sorting, and more. And so with immutable data, as you change the data in the grid state is maintained. This is also very efficient when compared to some of the other ways of updating the data in ngGrid. So this is very comparable to the transactional updates that are also another method for updating the grid data. So it's a very efficient process in which we are taking data from an immutable data source and presenting that data into a grid using ngGrid. As I've already mentioned several times, this works really well with immutable stores. So NgRx, Akita, MobX, NGXS, and more. As I mentioned, also, I'm going to be using NgRx. You could be using something else, but I've already written that for you. So let's go through this together. So there's a couple of requirements when working with immutable data in ngGrid. The first thing that we need to do is we're going to have to implement a get row node ID for tracking rows. And this is going to return an application assigned unique identifier for each row. So probably if you've got a model, maybe you've got customers, orders, you've probably got a customer ID or an order ID. And so you're going to use that for tracking of rows. You can think of this as like akin to the track by function in the ng-for structural directive in Angular. When a row is added, when ngGrid is going to do kind of a diff, right? It's going to look at the ID that is not already in the grid. And if you've got a new ID, it's going to go ahead and add that row in. A row is removed when the ID does not exist in the row data, and no longer exists in your row data, but is in the grid. And then a row is updated by checking object reference. And this is important, right? So it's not like if you're used to doing like Angular, for example, change detection uses what's called a differ function underneath the hood, which is going to do a deep comparison. So if you've got, 1,000 rows, and each row is an object has all these properties. In order to determine if any data has changed, it's got to do a deep comparison and check inside of every object if some value has changed, to basically recursively iterate through the object properties. However, if we're using immutable data, we don't need to do that because we know that whenever we change data with an immutable data store, we always return a new object. And so because of that, ngGrid can take advantage of that and simply do a simple object reference comparison. So it's a much more efficient comparison to basically say, hey, do I have a new row? Oh, this is not the same object. Let me go ahead and change the data in the grid. For those of you that are Star Wars fans, maybe this should have been a trivia, but maybe you could think about a Star Wars movie where this particular shot might have been in a Star Wars movie. I know Jason's a big fan. I don't know if he stepped away, but try to remember maybe what scene in what episode or, of Star Wars. And I believe, there's a scene that happens here. And again, this is in Spain, and the camera kind of pans along as they're on this kind of, I'm not sure where they're supposed to be. Maybe Jason can come up with the exact planet and everything for us. But this is, I took this shot to try to replicate that particular scene. So kind of a fun tidbit. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into immutable data. So let me pull up my thing here. And so what we're going to do is the first thing we need to do is we need to set the immutable data property to true on the ngGrid Angular custom element. Here you can see that I'm using row data, and I'm using the async pipe with an observable to pipe in the data to my ngGrid Angular component. I've also got my column definitions. If you attended the session this morning, or if you're already using ngGrid, this should look very familiar. And then here is the get row node ID input binding. And I need to provide a reference to a function that's going to be invoked that returns the unique identifier for that row node. Notice that this is a function in my component, and I'm not invoking the function, so there's no open and close parentheses after the name of the function. I'm simply providing a reference to that function, and ngGrid is going to invoke that function as necessary. So very similar to the track by behavior with the ng-for structural directive. Here is, I've got an immutable component, and here's where I'm implementing the getRowNodeID method. And so this is receiving a node. In this example, I've got a customer object that I'm getting of type customer. And then I'm going to return that number that's a unique ID. And I'm just going to go ahead and return the customer.id value. Let's go ahead and take a look at a demo. So go ahead and open up in VS Code or WebStorm or whatever code editor that you use, and open up inside of the source directory. There's a features directory. And then inside of there, we've got a data directory. And then inside of there, we've got an immutable directory. And I'm going to do that as well. So we're going to go to features, data, immutable. So source, app, features, data. Here's our immutable component. All right. So let's walk through a couple of different aspects here. Some of this is going to be a little specific to NgRx, but a lot of this, if you're using immutable data stores, this should you should be able to swap this out with whatever you're using. So in the ng on init lifecycle method, I need to go ahead and dispatch what's called an action. Again, don't be too concerned with the NgRx side of this. Basically, I'm saying, hey, you go fetch some customers for me, please. And it's going to do that. Here's our getRowNodeID method that we have to implement for the immutable data store. I showed you this earlier, where I'm basically returning that unique identifier for the customer ID. And let's come up and take a look. Here's my customers. These customers are, this is going to be what's called a selector in NgRx. But again, if you don't use NgRx, don't worry about it. Basically, know that customers is going to be an observable of an array of customer objects. And they're immutable. So if I change a customer, I'm not going to just change, let's say I change a customer's name. If I go in and change the name from Brian to Jason, I don't just change the name property in that customer object. I actually return a new object. So it's basically spread the existing customer, and then we're going to return a new object and overwrite the name property value. And so because I'm using immutable data, this is how I can leverage immutable data stores and synchronize that data down into my grid with AgGrid. A couple other things just to quickly show. This is, I've got a form that I'm building. So I'm using reactive forms for this. Here's my column definition. You can see that I'm outputting some of the customer information for my grid. I've got a selected customer. So when you select a row, I'm going to select that customer. Again, most of us I hope all of us in the room are very familiar with this, with AgGrid, having used it or at least attended the workshop this morning. But this is where I'm tracking the selected row. So I'm using the grid API to get the selected rows. And then I'm going to store the selected customer based on just the first row that's selected. And then I'm going to patch that value into my Angular form group. Finally, the onSubmit method is going to save the new customer data. Again, I'm using NgRx here, but the important thing to note is that I'm simply saying, hey, go update this customer. This is going to run what's called a reducer function, which is a pure function that's going to modify the data in my store in an immutable method or an immutable way. And so this is what our component looks like. Let's come over to our template. Here, I've got the immutable data property set to true. I've also enabled row selection, so you can only select a single row. Here's the grid ready event emitter, and I'm invoking the onGrid ready method in my component in that class and passing along the event object. So that way I can get access to the grid API. Here's the selection changed output emitter or event emitter. So when a user selects a row, I'm going to invoke that onSelectedChange method that we saw previously. Here's the required getRowNodeID input binding, and I'm binding to a reference of the getRowNodeID method in my component. And of course, we've got our row data up here, and I'm using the customer's observable that's returned from my store. So in this case, NgRx, and I'm using the async pipe to subscribe to that observable. And then of course, as we're used to seeing in pretty much every AG grid instance, unless you're doing some really cool things with the column and grid APIs, I'm defining my column definitions. I am using Angular material, but basically I've just got a form group down here. And this form group is where I can modify the customer that I've selected. The key here is the submit output binding, and I'm invoking the on submit method in order to send that data to my backend or to my whoever's going to deal with updating of the customer. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the demo. So this is under data immutable. Okay, so down here, if I scroll down a little bit, should I bump this font size up one more? Sure. Okay, so here is my immutable data. I've got all of my customers in my grid up here. And here's my edit customer form. You can see it's empty right now. Let's say I select the first row. Now I could come in and let's just change this. My wife's name is Bonnie, so I can change that to Bonnie. I can hit save. Again, NgRx is doing its thing. It's modifying that object and returning a new copy of that object. So we're using immutable data. And then if I come up to my grid, I can see that this row was updated accordingly. If I were to add additional data into the grid, it would compare the customer ID and add it as necessary. If I were to remove data from my data store, and it's it's still in the grid, AG Grid is going to see that and then remove that row from the grid. What the key takeaway here is, first of all, this works really great with, if you're already using an immutable data store, this is a great solution. Secondly, and most importantly, perhaps, is the performance benefit of this. If I've got a lot of data in my grid, and I've got a lot of state changes to the data that's in my grid, synchronizing this data in a highly efficient manner is something that is going to be almost necessary. Trying to re-render 10,000 rows or 1,000,000 rows of some sort of data every time one value changes in one cell is not an efficient way to do so, right? So if you've got an application where the data is changing rapidly, or you need efficient, mutating of that data in the grid, adding, removing rows and modifying existing rows, this is a great solution. And then furthermore, if you're already using a data store, this is a great solution for synchronizing the data between your data store and AG Grid. So this is a really incredibly powerful feature that AG Grid ships with. And this comes in the community edition of AG Grid. I don't think I mentioned this already. Everything I'm going to show you today is all in the community edition of AG Grid. So the community edition is free. And then they also have an enterprise edition, which is obviously not free and comes with additional features, functionality, and benefits. I should also mention, while we're real quickly on the topic of enterprise edition, I don't work for AG Grid, and I don't get any sort of royalties off of you purchasing. So I have no skin in the game, if you will. I'm just want to teach you what I've learned about AG Grid, and I'm happy to be here today. So by no means am I trying to sell you on AG Grid. I use it personally, and I've said this morning in the workshop. I do a lot of Angular consulting and web consulting in general with clients, and I've worked with very large enterprise clients, and AG Grid is well suited for those types of applications. And so I certainly, when I need a grid and a powerful grid, I look to AG Grid as a tool to bring in and to use the features and the functionality that it provides. So, okay, let's go back over to here and let's do an exercise. So let me go ahead and copy this for you. Let me go ahead and put this in our chat window. As I mentioned, we're going to be using Code Sandbox for doing some of the exercises. And while you get that up and running, you can sign up for a Code Sandbox account using like GitHub and such, or I think you can actually just not sign up if you don't want to keep if you don't want to save these. But the first thing I want to show you that's kind of a tricky part about Code Sandbox is it's awesome that they have this live preview on the right. Unfortunately, it kind of gets stuck sometimes, has been my experience when building out these exercises. And so let me boost the size of my display here. And I want to show you this icon up here. So, oh, sorry, that wasn't what I wanted. Let's get a big arrow. Wow. That icon right there. So if you hit this icon, this will toggle the browser that's on the right. And basically what I do when I'm working with Code Sandbox is I'm like, listen, I don't want you to update like every keystroke, and it'll error and sometimes it'll get stuck for whatever reason, I'm not sure. I go and just hide that. And then I work through my exercise or work on the solution. I code it all up. And then once I'm kind of ready to test it out, I hit this, I bring it back, I let it do all its magic and start to display things for me. You may notice if you don't do this, that Code Sandbox may kind of crash. It did that to me a couple of times. At one point, I thought my laptop was going to elevate off my desk. The fan was spinning so hard. So just go ahead and close that and then work on the exercise. So I've given you the exercise. What I want you to do is when the user selects a row, which is a customer, and clicks the delete button, I want you to delete the customer from the store. So you're going to enable single row selection, as I showed you. You're going to track the selected customer using the selection changed output binding on the AG-grid Angular component. And then I want you to enable immutable data and implement the getRowNodeID method. And then we're going to implement the onDelete method to delete the customer from the store. So let me go ahead and leave that up for you on the screen. If you've got any questions in the meantime, please feel free to put those in the Q&A. Happy to answer any questions that you may have. This one's going to maybe take a little bit of effort. It is 33 after my time, and so it's 1:33 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Why don't I give you 7 minutes? So we'll pick this back up at 40 after, and I will walk through the solution with you. And I'm going to stand up. I've got a standing desk. I like to change my position throughout the day.
So, oh, maybe he did add it. Perfect. Yeah, Andy did add it to the Q&A. I'll let you pick that up.
Can immutable data work with the server-side row model data source? Yes, is my understanding. I would double check the docs, Andy, but I believe so. The reason why I say yes, question mark, is I have not personally used immutable data with the server-side enterprise edition of AG-grid. But based on just reading their docs and kind of following some of their code, I believe so. If not, certainly let us know, throw it in the chat or something if you figure out otherwise. Some other people might be interested in knowing that as well. Okay, awesome. Let's go ahead and move along to the exercise. Ruben, no worries if you can't code along. Keep watching, hang out with us for the next couple hours if you want. Hopefully you'll be able to learn a lot there. You can always rewatch this. We're gonna have these recordings available and you could get the links and kind of go through the exercises if you want later. All right, let's do the exercise together. So we're going to, when the user selects a row, which is a customer, and clicks the delete button, delete the customer from the store. So let me pull this up real quick. All right, so we're going to go to app component. And we need to have this on selection change invoked. So let's go over to the template real quick. And here we need to do, what is it, selection change? Let me just double check my selection changed. And we're gonna call the on selection changed method and pass along the event object. While I'm in here, I might as well just set the immutable data to true. And I might as well also set the row selection to single. So we allow row selection. I've got my row data in here and my column defs. So let's go back over to our app component. I've got the grid API here. And so what I need to do is I need to get access to the selected customer. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to do const selection. And we're going to get from the API, we're going to get the selected rows. I'm going to just check that there's a length. So I'm going to say if selection.length equals 0. Let's just get out of here. Oops. Let's just get out of here and do nothing. Otherwise, we're going to do this dot selected customer, which I haven't defined yet, but I will. And we're just going to pluck off the first selected row. So let's come up here and define a selected customer. So we'll do private selected customer. It's going to be of type customer. All right. So we did that. Let's go back over to here. I did the row selection, but the immutable data. But as soon as I do immutable data, I know that I also need to use the required get row node ID. So let's go ahead and implement that. So we're going to do get row node ID. And I'm going to give it reference to the get row node ID method in my component. So now I need to define that. So we're going to do get row node ID. And that's going to return a number. And I'm going to return, it's going to get the customer, be past the customer. And I'm going to return the customer.id value. So again, similar to the track by function. Okay, so I've got my selection changed, output, event emitter. I got my input binding for the get row node ID. I'm giving it the get row node ID reference. I've set immutable data to true. I've got row selection set to single. All right. The next thing I need to do is when the user clicks the delete button, I need to delete the customer. So what I'm going to do is go over to here. And I've got on delete, and I want to delete the selected customer. And so there's a little tiny piece of NgRx here that I need, but I gave you a hint. So I'm going to dispatch off this delete customer, and the ID is going to be the selected customer ID. And I should probably check that I have a selected customer. So let's just say, if not, this dot selected customer, and let's just get out of here. It's kind of a little bit of a guard there. Okay, let me go back to Keynote. Yep.
I don't want to stop you too much, but Neil has a very time appropriate question in the Q&A.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, Neil, that actually would probably be more efficient. So thank you for pointing that out. What Neil is saying is, why bother doing the selection changed? What I could do, and probably should do, is just up here. So I could have a grid ready method, which I don't have. So I'm accessing the grid API here. But Neil, you're probably familiar with the grid ready method or event emitter, right? That output binding on the AG grid component. Here, I could have done something like grid ready, and then I could have said on grid ready, passed along the value. I'm just gonna leave it out for now. Then I would have access to the grid API. And then at basically at the time that I actually need the selected customer ID, when I go to delete it, then I could just use this same snippet of code, say, hey, give me the selected rows. If it's equal to 0, I don't do anything. Otherwise, I know my selected customer, I go off, I dispatch and delete that. So that would certainly be, I would say, another approach, and perhaps arguably a better approach, rather than tracking the selection changed every time the user selects a row. So really good point. All right, let's go ahead and try this out. So I'm going to open up my code sandbox. And let's hope this works. See if I didn't try deleting myself. And there we go. We can see that that row was deleted because, again, remember that get row node ID over here? This saw that that row node ID no longer existed in the row data, which is that immutable data coming back from my immutable store. And I'm unwrapping, if you will, using the async pipe to subscribe to that observable and binding that down into the row data. But really good question. I love it. And keep them coming. I want this to be, learning for both of us. So if there's something that you see that you've got another idea, or you're like, hey, what about this? Throw it out there for all of us. That'd be great. Okay. Let's see. I had talked about changing this up. And what I want to do is I want to get right into the meat of this. And if we've got time, we're an hour in. The immutable data is a great thing to learn, but I want to get right into the components. So I'm going to skip over some of the styling aspects, and we can get into, if we've got time at the end, would love to take you through the styling stuff. And you can check out the docs on styling as well. But we're going to skip. Unfortunately, you're going to miss some of my pictures from some of my other travels, but oh well. So here we go. Let's talk about building custom components to extend the functionality of AG-Grid with Angular. And so I really love this, and I get excited about this section because it's really powerful. Now, AG-Grid certainly ships with a very rich set of features that I can leverage to do sorting, filtering. I can kind of override things like the sort order. I can do all kinds of really cool things around paging of data. I can do, we saw this morning, if you were with us, we did the infinite row model where I can infinitely stream chunks of data into my grid. But one of the things that's also really cool about AG-Grid is the ability to build on top of AG-Grid using components. Now, this is certainly an Angular workshop. If you work at an organization or in a shop, if you will, that uses other frameworks, there is certainly the same or very similar solutions for other frameworks. So you can build custom components for AG-Grid with React, with Vue. I believe they've got Svelte. I'd have to double check. I think they've got, or at least started to add Svelte support. And then the other thing that's really neat is maybe you work in an organization that uses multiple frameworks for your front end technologies. You might be using Angular and React or Angular and Vue. You can actually write web components. So kind of going down a little bit lower, less abstraction. You can write web components as custom components that extend the functionality of AG-Grid. And so I had a question this morning about, well, should I write it as a web component or should I write it as an Angular component? And the answer to that is really based on your organization. If you're an Angular organization and you don't foresee using other frameworks in at least the near term, then I would just leverage your existing skill set and knowledge and write the component in Angular. If you are using multiple frameworks, that's where you're going to want to probably look at using something like web components. Again, this would be if you want this component to be shared amongst projects that are using various frameworks. But if you're using Angular and that's it, then I would just go ahead and write out these components using Angular. Like I said, this extends the provided functionality of AG-Grid through custom Angular components. So what are some of the components that we can build? We can do custom cell renderers. So we can there's a cell renderer property in the column definition where we have a function that we could return a HTML string or an HTML element and provide a custom cell renderer. But I could take that a step further and provide a custom component to do the cell rendering. I can do the same thing for editing of values. I can have a custom cell editor. I can have a date component. I can have a filter component. We can do a floating filter component. We're going to do that here in a little bit. I can have a custom header. So that top header of my AG-Grid, I can have a custom header up there, custom loading cell, a custom overlay, status bar, tool panel, and tooltip. And some of these other ones are enterprise only, just a note. So we're going to build some custom components. We're going to build a filter component. We're going to build a renderer component. We're going to build an editor component. And we're going to build, I've got filter here twice. Maybe we're just doing the top three. Sorry about that. No, we're doing a header. That's what I meant to put here. Let's fix that. And we're going to do a custom header component. Why don't we actually take a quick break? We're at the top of the hour, and I want to make sure everybody gets an opportunity if you need to take a brain break or step away. Why don't we take, let's do, it's 2 of, why don't we pick back up at 5 after? So why don't we take 7 minutes? Why don't you, if you need to step away, because this next section, we really need to spend some time and focus in on it. And I don't want to go too long without a break. So let's, okay. We are at 7 after. Why don't we go ahead and get started with registering components. So in this section, what I want to do is I want to teach you how we get started with these custom components. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to register the components. And so the way we need to do this is there is the static method, which you've probably seen on the ng-grid module. So the ng-grid module is what we use inside of our ng module. Inside of that imports array in the metadata for our module, we use the AG module class, and then we invoke this static method called with components. And if you're not using any components, you probably just pass in an empty array. But this is where we're going to register the components globally for use in AG-Grid. The second thing that we need to do is we need to register them by name via the framework components input binding on the AG-Grid Angular component. You will also see in the documentation that you can register components by reference, and there's kind of some pros and cons around this. My general takeaway has been, and what I tend to follow, is registering them by name. So I won't be covering registering by reference. So we're gonna register them by a name, and then we're gonna use that name that we specify as a key to tell the grid to use this particular component for a filter or whatever it is that we're going to do. So here's how we do that. So here is my AG-Grid module with components. And here I am registering a bunch of components. So I'm registering all of these components with AG-Grid. So I've got a currency renderer component. I've got a date filter component. I've got a material header component that we're going to use and we're going to learn. And I've got a slider filter component. The next thing we need to do is we need to tell the specific grid that we're working with about the custom framework components that we would like to be made available. And the way we do that is through the framework components input binding. So I'm going to use this input binding on the AG-Grid Angular component. And then I'm going to provide it a reference to the framework components property in my component class. And this framework components property is going to be an object where the key is the name and then the value is a reference to the component itself. Let's look at that next. So here I have a filter component. And inside this filter component, I've got a property called framework components. And I've set that equal to an object. And I'm registering these components by name. So there's no double quotes around this because it's just this, it's a valid property name for an object. Or in other words, it doesn't have any dashes or dots or anything in it. And so the name that I'm registering this component under is date filter. And then I'm giving it a reference to my date filter component. So this date filter component, this is an actual Angular component. This is a class. And so I'm importing this at the top, using an ES6 import, and I'm bringing in the reference to that component. Again, here's my slider filter. I'm registering this component by name, and I'm giving it a reference to the slider filter component that I've imported up above. Once I've done that, now I can actually use my component where appropriate. So if it's a filter component in this particular instance, let's say I've got a date of order field. So this is, I've got orders in my table, and this is a date that the order was placed. And I want to have a floating filter component that's a custom component that I'm going to build. I don't really like the built-in date filter. It just uses the, like whatever your browser's filter is, which is okay, but it's really not that highly usable. And I may want to have a consistent user experience across devices, browsers, and OSs. And so I might want to use a custom filter component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the floating filter, and then I'm going to specify the floating filter component to use. And in this case, I'm going to give it the name of the filter that I'm going to use. So notice that it's in single quotes, and this references back to the name that was registered. So that is the name of the component that I registered. Once I've done that, I could pass along params to my floating filter. The parameters that you pass along to your custom components are going to be the built-in parameters based on the type of component that you're building. So for example, I'm building a floating filter. So you can pass along all of the default params that you could pass to any floating filter. And further, you can extend that interface for your own custom component and pass along additional custom parameters to your component that you're building. So in other words, you could allow parameters in here for your application and your needs, whether you want to do like some feature toggles, some UI toggles, or whatever it is that you need to pass along to that custom component. Okay, so here's the component interfaces. So there's an interface in general. Yeah. So there's an interface for each component type, and this is what's going to do. It's going to enforce a code contract, right? And that's exactly what interfaces do. So every component, custom component that we're building for AG Grid, the first thing we're going to do is we're always going to implement this code contract via the interface. So we'll have the name of our component. So I have like export, class, date filter component, and then it's going to implement the floating filter component, or it's going to implement the cell renderer Angular component. And this is what is going to help us to ensure that we are meeting the code contract when creating a custom component for AG Grid. So let's take a look at it first to get started with. We're going to take a look at a cell renderer component, and then we'll take a look at a filter, and then I think maybe a header, and then also a cell editing component. So the cell renderer component is such. So by default, the values that are rendered in a cell are rendered as simple text. So whatever's in your row data or whatever data you supply to AG Grid, it's going to render that as text. We can use a custom cell renderer component to render simple to complex HTML. If you were with us this morning, we looked at the cell renderer property in the column definition object, and it certainly can use that to provide a custom HTML or to provide an HTML element that's going to be rendered in the cell. But if I have additional features or functionality that I want to be able to render, I can use a custom cell renderer component. The other thing that I like about this is that I can encapsulate the logic of that cell renderer. So you may have a cell renderer in several of your grids, and they're all doing the same thing. Or maybe you break that function out and you put it in a file and import it, and that's a good step forward. But if you really want to take it a step further, perhaps you may want to encapsulate that logic into a component, and then you can reuse that component between grids in a project or perhaps even an organization. If you've heard of NX, which is an ability, or Angular workspaces, where you're using multiple Angular applications and you're sharing resources between those, this would be a great opportunity. So if you've got a large organization with a lot of projects that are using AG Grid, you create a library inside of your workspace that has all of these, or maybe slices or different variations of kind of custom components that you're going to be using throughout your application to render something. Again, maybe you're rendering some sort of inline graph like a spark line or whatever it is for your organization. So what we want to do is we're going to create a currency renderer component that renders values, and we're just going to use the Angular currency pipe to do so. So we're going to develop a currency renderer component that uses the currency pipe. We're going to implement the ng-init lifecycle method to access the cell's value via the iCell renderer params object. We're going to implement the refresh lifecycle method. I'll show you how we can return false, which will allow ngGrid to create and destroy the rendered component, or we can use Angular's change detection to handle that, and we'll return true. We'll register that custom component as I showed you with the framework components input binding, and then we're going to use our new currency renderer. So that's what we're kind of embarking on here for now. Let me show you the demo of that first, and then we're going to get into the code. Oh, I actually have this in Chrome. So if I come down to the custom components, I take a look at the renderer, you can see here that the total value is rendered using the currency value. So if I change this, we can see that it updates. So now let's take a look at the code for that. The first thing that we need to do, as I mentioned, is we're going to extend or implement the interface. So this is a cell renderer. So I'm going to implement the iCell renderer Angular component or comp interface. This extends two other interfaces that we need to quickly look at. So it extends the iCell renderer and the AG framework component interface, which gets the default params for a cell renderer. And we can override these generics if we need to. And this is what the iCell renderer looks like. The iCell renderer requires that we have a refresh method. It's going to receive a params object, and it's going to return a Boolean value. So this gets called to basically refresh the values of the rendering of a cell. We can return true, and that basically signals to ngGrid that we handled the change, the refresh, if you will. If we return false, then ngGrid's going to do the refresh for us. And the way ngGrid is going to do that refresh is it's going to destroy the component and then create a new component instance. Probably a little bit more expensive than we need, but it is an option if we don't want to deal with the refresh ourselves. Inside of our template, this is going to be pretty simple. We're simply going to take a value, we're going to pipe that into the currency pipe, and that's going to give us that currency formatting that we want. So here's my cell renderer component. Again, we see that I'm going to, excuse me, implement the iCell renderer Angular comp interface. I'm going to keep track of a value. The ng-init is a lifecycle method that is required as part of the AG framework component interface. So if we come back here, remember this interface also extends this AG framework component interface. This requires, or maybe it's not required, this has an optional ng-init lifecycle method. So it's similar to ng-init. It's just when the component has been initialized by ngGrid. We're going to receive a params object, and that's going to be of type iCell renderer params. I'm going to go ahead and keep track of that value. So I'm going to set this.value equals the params value. That, of course, inside of Angular is going to trigger that value to be rendered via our template. Now, if the value is ever changed and we need to refresh that value, like when I changed it to 5,000, ngGrid is going to invoke this refresh method for us and provide a params object. That is that same iCell renderer params object. Again, we're going to return a Boolean based on whether we did the refresh or not. In this case, I'm going to just update the value. Angular change detection is going to get triggered. It's going to re-render the template. And so I'm going to return true and say, hey, I got this. Don't worry about it. I then need to register this. So now that I've created my custom cell renderer component, I need to go ahead and register this using the with components method on the ngGrid module. And I'm going to pass in an array. And then here is a reference to my component. Now, I didn't include this, but it should be noted perhaps in my declarations, I of course need to declare this component so that Angular is aware of it. The next thing we need to do is we're going to bind our framework components input property. We learned this earlier, to my framework components property in my class. And here's my framework components property where I've registered by name my custom currency renderer component. And here's the name that I've registered it as, currency renderer. And then up here in my cell renderer property, I'm setting the currency renderer name that I'm going to use. So if we come over to the code, I kind of broke it out for you in these slides, but you can reference this because we're about to get into an exercise. So if you come over to components, renderer, if you look at renderer component, this is the component that uses the currency renderer. So you'll see this is imported up above. And you'll see that I'm using it here and registering it by name. If we actually go to the component, you'll see all the code that I showed you before, right? So here's my actual component, and here is my template for that component. All right, let's do an exercise. Let me go ahead and open this up for you. Okay, so go ahead and open up that exercise. We're going to be using Code Sandbox, like I've mentioned. So go ahead and open that up and follow these instructions. I'll leave them on the screen for you. What we're going to do is we're going to create a date renderer. So very similar to what I just showed you with a currency renderer. The only difference is we're going to use the date component. So just a slight variation on that. But go ahead and follow along, and I've got instructions for you in the component, and you can use the date pipe in the template, register the component. We're going to define our custom framework components, and then we're going to wire those up to the grid.
And please put any questions you've got down in the Q&A, or if you want to, raise your hand. I'd be happy to let you talk to Brian. And I guess while we wait, let's see. So what do you do in your spare time, Brian? We haven't really talked about that much. Do you have much spare time working for Google?
I don't work for Google. I'm a Google developer expert, but I don't work for Google. I have my own consulting company.
Nice.
But yeah, when I'm not in front of my keyboard, I like to I recently got into mountain biking, as I shared a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
And then I do a lot of skiing in the winter and hiking, camping, just enjoy being outside.
I imagine Portland's pretty good for mountain biking. There's got to be a lot of good trails in the area.
There's a lot of good trails. There's a whole bunch of them up in the mountains and around. Yeah, so some good mountain biking, some great hiking. My wife and I went up to Olympic National Park, which is up in Washington. I think it's like pretty much the most northern western part of the continental United States, but gorgeous. We did some great hiking up there, and yeah.
Yeah, my brother used to live in Seattle. It's a beautiful area up in there. Just across the border into BC, and Victoria is also a great place to go visit too. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. No real movies.
If you have any questions, anybody just raise your hand or put it in the queue. I guess raise your hand once you're done. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A so that way I could keep the two separate.
Good idea. Yeah, it's kind of a strange time, right? I mean, normally you talk about movies or something. I guess there are the big TV shows, right? Well, not TV shows, but streaming shows. You've got like the Umbrella Academy and the Mandalorian are two of the big ones I can think of in my head right now. Do you do much streaming?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I like. We watched all the Umbrella Academy. It was good. And the second series of the Mandalorian came out recently. I guess maybe we're a little behind. Sometimes we try to like finish one thing before going on to the next. And so we're starting to work our way through that. So it's been good.
Cool. What else? I mean, you've mentioned food a couple of times today, right? What's your favorite kind of food?
I was saying to my wife, I think last night, I said, I think if I had an apartment or I lived across the street from a great Thai restaurant, Indian restaurant, and tacos, I think I would not need a kitchen. I could just uninstall the kitchen. I'd have a little extra room in my house or my apartment or whatever, because I think I could just live off of tacos, vindaloo, and Thai.
Oh, nice. That sounds awesome. Sounds really awesome.
Yeah, no. I like, we've got a good Thai restaurant that's across the street that we like. It's kind of, we always want to try new places, but when you can, they're like across the street from our building. And when you can just like call up and walk over in like 5 minutes and just pick up Thai food, I'm just like, it's pretty easy.
It's tough to go someplace else.
It is, but it's right there.
Yeah, that's true. So Thai food, tacos, and vindaloo all sound really good. And now I'm hungry again.
I like mostly spicy. I mean, I've got a buddy of mine that'll do like Thai hot. No way. I would be crying. Like I would be chugging milk.
So are we talking jalapeno? A little bit hotter than jalapeno?
I'll do jalapeno for sure. Like, like a raw jalapeno on like a taco or something. Or I mean, I won't eat it straight, but
habanero.
The taco place across the street as well. They have a habanero sauce. It's like I'm a glutton for punishment. Like every time, I think about 2/3 of the way through, I'm just like, too much habanero sauce. And my wife is like, you're never gonna learn. I think the first time I got it, like I got the big size and I took my taco, just dunked it into the whole, like, and took like 3 bites, and I was like, oh boy. Oh.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Gonna need some yogurt or something.
Definitely coat your mouth, coat your tongue in like something dairy related.
Yeah, not water. Water does not do much for you.
No, it actually makes it worse. Water and soda are a bad idea.
There's speaking of streaming, there's like a YouTube channel where this guy eats really hot chicken wings with like celebrities. Have you ever heard of it? Don't know the name of it.
What's it called?
Hot Ones.
Hot Ones, yes.
That came right up. Yeah.
Yes. Hot Ones. Very good.
The best episode I watched was with Shaq.
Oh, really?
Like he was like, you're not gonna get me, right? And, at one point, like the gallon of milk was sitting next to him, and he's just like, whoa. I was like, that was such a good one. I was like, oh my gosh. And Shaq's awesome, but that was a great episode.
So Shaq did that one chip challenge also on ESPN, right? Where he ate the chip.
I didn't see that.
You can find it on YouTube.
I'll have to check it out.
But yeah, we had a guy do the one chip challenge during stand-up one day on camera. That was pretty funny.
What is the one chip challenge?
It's a box that's got one chip in it. And I think it's ghost pepper. And so the guy that did it during stand-up said that it hits you really hard at first, but then it's gone. So he's like, if you can make it through that pain, you're good. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now we're getting recommendations of Shia LaBeouf and DJ Khaled.
Yeah. DJ Khaled. I forgot to give a time. Shoot.
We've got one hand up.
Okay, give me a hands up if you made it through the exercise for the date renderer. 4. All right. 6, 7, 8, 9. Nice. All right. Let me get this up for me. So we're going to walk through this together. Let's see, date cell.
So I guess while he's doing that, and people are giving Hot Ones recommendations, mine is Alton Brown. I loved his show on Food Network, and his Hot Ones episode is awesome.
That's cool. All right, if you finish the exercise, give me a raise your hand. Let me know that you're done. I don't want to.
To about 15 now,
16, 17. Okay. Cleans the wings. There's a good point to that, Matt, right? I mean, like, I think at some point, like, I think I've only ever seen the Shaq one, but I think he takes like one bite and it's like that. He's like, I'm like done. It's like, no, come on, man. You got to finish that thing. Dude, some people can eat hot food like that.
Oh, what's the name of the guy that does Hot Ones? I watched an interview with him.
I don't know.
And he said that the thing that people don't realize is that he's eating the wings along with everybody else. So he's eating many of these hot wings. So I just thought that was, Chris Evans. That's right.
Champion.
Looks like
here's our date renderer. Here's our template. Here's our module. Here's our component. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the exercise. If you completed it, go ahead and raise your hand. But let's go through it together. Okay, so we're going to open the date renderer component. And the first thing I need to do is I need to implement the iCell renderer Angular comp interface. So we're going to do implements iCell renderer Angular comp interface. And immediately you can see that, my code is not right. I got an error. It's saying I'm missing the following properties from this type, from this interface, refresh and ng-init. So I got to go ahead and do that. So I've already got my cell value up here. So what I need to do is I'm going to do an ng-init method. And ng-init is going to get called with a params object. And the params object is of type iCell renderer params. And I'm going to go ahead and set my value equal to the params dot value property. And then in the refresh method, I need to return a Boolean. First, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to return false, and I'm going to let AGGrid refresh the component. And again, it's going to destroy and recreate the component, but we should see in our grid that the value does change. Let's come over to our template. Let's do value, and I'm going to pipe this to the currency pipe. I need to register this inside of my AGGrid module with components. So I'm going to register the date renderer component here. And I need to also declare it. Okay, and then I need to come over to my app component. And I'm going to use my custom date renderer here. But the first thing I need to do is I need to keep track of these components. I'm going to call this framework components. And it's going to be an object. And I'm going to call this just the date renderer. And this is going to be the date renderer component that I've imported up above. And then here I'm going to use the cell renderer. Why is it? Oh, it wants a comma there, right? And then I'm going to give it the name of date renderer. Don't want a semicolon there. And then need to come into my template, and I need to, oh, I already did that for us. So we already have the framework components bound in. So let's go ahead and open up our component. It's taking a while. Sometimes Code Sandbox, I can hear my fan is spinning. What do we got? Not a number. What did I miss here? Oh, I didn't want to put it here. I want it on the currency. Oh, I apologize. This is supposed to be the total column. Let's get rid of this. It's not going to like this. This is supposed to be the total, not the date of order. That's a bug. Go ahead and file a PR. Or no, this is supposed to be, wait, why did I call it date renderer? Oh, right, duh. Sorry, I'm getting confused. My apologies. Date of order, I used the currency pipe. This is supposed to be the date pipe. Duh. Let's see if that works. Yep, wrong pipe. Thanks, guys. Sorry, but thank you, everybody. Oh, and here is my sandbox crashing. I went all morning without it crashing. Let's see. All right, yay. So there's our date renderer. Let's see, I could do long. So now I could do this. Of course, if I wanted to, make this a really usable date renderer component, I probably could have an additional param into my component where the user could specify the format. So that would be a nice improvement on this. Okay. Next, let's go into the floating filter. So floating filters extend the functionality of an underlying filter. So when we configure AG Grid, we can set a filter, and then we can enable a floating filter as if we want to, which will be in the additional row that's below the header row. We can create custom floating filters using Angular and creating components that are going to get rendered in that spot where the floating filter goes. What we'll do is we'll use an onParent model changed method in our component, and that onParent model changed method is going to get invoked by AG Grid, and it notifies the my floating filter of the parent filter model change event. Because remember, it's extending it, right? So we've got the filter that's just the default. Let me go over to here. And if we just look at one of our filtering examples, right? This is the actual filter. When we add the floating filter that goes down below this filter, the floating filter will be here, and that actually extends the filter. And so if the user changes the value in the parent filter, we need to have a way to notify the child component, if you will, the floating filter, that that model has changed. And so we're going to be implementing this method as part of this exercise. So what we want to do is we're going to create a floating filter component that uses the material slider for filtering number values. So I'm going to create this component. I'm going to use the mat slider component. I'm going to define some custom params this time. So rather than just having the default parameters like we used before, I'm going to create an interface that has some custom parameters for passing the parameters to the filter. And I could pass those values down in my column definition object, so I can customize the filter if I want. I'm going to implement the method that I talked about previously, the onParent model changed lifecycle method. I'm going to use the input output binding. Yeah, it's a bit confusing. So on mat slider, the name of the binding that actually sends the value out of the mat slider is called input. I'm not sure why. And then we're going to invoke the onFloatingFilterChanged method on the number filter instance to filter a column. Then we're going to go through the usual steps that we've been doing all along in terms of registering that filter. Let me show you a demo of what this is going to look like before we actually build it. Okay, so here's my demo and here's my slider. So you can see over here that I'm sliding this up, and as I slide it up and up and up, the max value that I have is 5,000. As I bring this down, it's filtering my totals for my orders. So I'm not sure if the use case is ideal for this. I don't know why you'd want to necessarily look for orders this way, but perhaps you do. And so this is one way that we can kind of, this is a matte slider in a custom Angular component in a floating filter. I also have a date of order, and I like this one. So this is now this is using Angular materials date, right? So rather than using the built-in date filter that comes with ngGrid, if I want to, I can use a custom component to do so. So let's target this 11/11/2019. So I can go 2019, November 11th. And now I just see all the orders that were placed on that day. So this is another great example of using a custom component for a floating filter. And all of this code is located in this component. So if you go to shared components, I've got the slider filter in there, and then I also have the date filter. Let's go ahead and walk through the code. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to implement our interface again. This is kind of the first step that I like to do, so that way I know that I'm meeting the code contract. So I'm going to implement the iFloatingFilter comp interface, which extends iFloatingFilter, and then it extends the framework component. And this time the generic is the iFloatingFilter params. This is what the iFloatingFilter code contract or interface looks like. And there's that onParent model change method that I must, so it's required. So I have to define this method. It's going to receive the parent model along with a filter changed event and returns void. Again, AG framework component. This is the interface for a component. There's your generic T. And here is the AG Init Lifecycle method and the params object of type T. Here's what my matte slider is going to look like. I'm going to use the material slider. So if you're not using Angular material, you can go to the docs and look at it if you like. But basically, I'm going to have a max and min value that I'm going to bind into that. I'm going to let the user, and what I mean by user is like the user of my component, set this. So I'm going to have some additional filter params where you could set the min and max based on what you want. Here's the value that we're going to set for the current value of the slider. And then here's that input binding. It's an output event emitter called input, which is weird. And I'm going to call onInput and get the event object. Okay, here is my custom params interface that I've mentioned. So I'm going to define a new interface called slider filter params. And then I'm going to extend the iFloatingFilter params. So those iFloatingFilter params are the default parameters that you can pass to any floating filter in ngGrid. And I'm going to add these two additional properties, max and min. So now that we've kind of taken a look at those interfaces, let's get started with the actual filter component itself. So I'm going to implement the interfaces just like we talked about. So iFloatingFilter and AG framework component. Notice I didn't actually extend iFloatingFilter component. This is because I wanted to override this generic T, right? I wanted to specify my own params object. So that's why I have to implement both of these. And this gives me the opportunity to provide my own custom params interface or signature. I'm going to go ahead and keep track of that min and max value. I have the initial value of the slider. And then I'm going to keep track of the params that are passed to the slider. So just a couple properties in my class. When the component is initialized by ngGrid, it's going to, the AG Init Lifecycle method is invoked. And I get my params that are of my interface, that slider filter params that I defined. I'm going to keep a reference to the params object, and I'm going to set the max and min based on whatever the user specified when they're using or implementing this filter in their column definition. Here's that required method, the onParent model changed, and I'm going to get the parent model. In this instance, the parent model is a number filter model because I'm building a slider filter that is going to extend the functionality of the default number filter. As long as I've got a parent model value, I want to update my value with whatever the user entered into that menu option in ngGrid. Otherwise, I'm just going to go with a default value of 0. Here's my method whenever the slider is changed. So it receives the event object, which is of type slider change. I'm going to pluck off the value, and I'm going to store that. And then this is where I need to notify the parent filter that something has changed in the child floating filter. So on the params object, so on the iFloating filter params interface, I've got a parent filter instance. I'm going to invoke that instance with a callback function. So if you're using the data source, and you remember from when we did the data source this morning with the infinite row model, this kind of callback signature should look familiar. So I'm going to get an instance of my parent number filter. And then on that instance, I'm going to notify it that we've had a value change. So I'm going to invoke onFloating filter changed. And then I need to specify kind of, these are different for every filter type that you're using. So if you're building a filter component that extends the date filter, then you're going to have maybe some different signature here. But I'm going to say choose any value that's greater than the value that the user has selected, or the value that they've selected because of the slider. Okay, this should look familiar. We're going to register our component using the ngGrid module with component static method. And then here's where I'm actually going to use my filter component. So the filter you'll notice is the default built-in AG number column filter, and I'm allowing the greater than filter params, that option in the dropdown, and only that option. And then here's where we bring in our custom component. So I'm going to set up the floating filter to be true. I'm going to bring in my custom component. Remember, we register by name, so that's a string. And then here's my floating filter component params object. So I could pass in this, for example, suppress filter button is built into any floating filter. And so I can use that parameter as well as any custom parameters for my specific component. Again, we're going to go ahead and register our components. So here I'm registering a couple of components by name, and then I'll need to register those with the specific ngGrid Angular component. So that way it knows about the components that I have available. So this should say exercise. So what I want to do is, so I did a slider. What I want you to do is I want you to do that date filter, and you can use, if you get stuck or you have any problems, you can use the date filter component that I wrote. Remember back here, I had the date filter, and this is using ngGrid. So I've got a solution for you. Of course, try to do the exercise if you can without the solution. Well, why don't you go ahead and build out a custom floating filter component that uses materials date picker. So this is a nice UI. So you're going to open this component, follow some instructions. Excuse me, talking all day. You're going to open this module. We need to do our registration as we're used to. We got to define the custom framework components, add that in. A lot of what I just showed you with the floating filter for the slider. So kind of very similar flow to what I just did. The only difference is you're going to be using the material date picker. And if I go over to the code sandbox, I'm going to close that tab. My computer is going to start melting. Let me open this up. Yeah, sometimes just doesn't like it. So if we go over to the date filter, I already wrote the material code for you. The goal of this exercise is not to learn how to write a material date picker. So I've already got the date picker here for you. And you should see that here's the date control. So I've already got the form control wired up for you. So you should be able to, don't worry about the actual material side of things. You got a form control that you can use the value changes observable on, and we can subscribe to that value changes observable and get access to the date value. So like any good instructor, I've got a solution file just in case we get stuck. So we can key on the important learning points and not get stuck in the weeds here. Okay, so I've got my date control. I've got my input disabled. I'm also going to need to keep track of the params. So I probably should have done that. And it did kind of hint to that here. But let's go ahead and keep track of those params. So I'm going to do a private variable called params. And this is going to be the date filter params. And it looks like I need to bring those in. Is that not, where's date filter params? Oh, right. I need to actually define my date filter params. Duh. Sorry, I apologize. I need to follow my own instructions. So let's just create an interface. Let's call this date filter params. And we're going to extend the I floating filter params. And we're going to have an input disabled property that's of type Boolean. So that way we can disable it if we'd like to. And then here's my date filter params. I'm going to create an ng-init lifecycle method. So ng-init, and in here, we're going to keep track of our params. So this was called with our params object, which is a date filter params. And I'm going to set that. And I'm also going to set the input disabled property. So I'm going to do this dot input disabled equals params dot input disabled. Now let's come down into the ng-init lifecycle method. And we want to subscribe to the value changes observable, on the date control. So up here, I've got my date control. That's a form control. And I see here that I've got a subscription. So I'm probably going to use that to track my subscription. And looks like I've got an ng destroy already that's going to unsubscribe from my subscription. So let's do this dot subscription equals, and then we're going to do this dot date control dot value changes. And on the value changes observable, I'm going to subscribe and I'm going to get the value. Let's make sure I'm doing this right. Yes. And now that I've got the value, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, remember we've got this parent filter instance and we get a callback. We're going to give it a callback method and we're going to get the date filter itself. And so when the value subscribes here, I'm going to do this dot params, and I'm going to get the parent filter instance. And I'm going to invoke that with a callback that's going to receive an instance of the date filter. And then inside of here, I'm going to do on the instance, I'm going to invoke on floating filter changed. And then I'm going to provide that with some values. So if I look at this on floating filter value change, it wants a type and a value. And if I look at the date filter, let's see, are they going to provide it for me? There's the date filter model. Set params. Where is the, it must be farther up. But we know that we've got the type. So we're going to set this type. I'm going to say, give me just dates that equal. So if you look in the documentation for the date filter, there's a bunch of different types, right? Just like the number filter has like equal, greater than, less than, all the options that kind of show up for a particular filter. So I'm only going to look for dates that have a particular value. And then I'm going to get this date value. Let me call this date up here. And this is actually going to be a JavaScript date that's coming out of Angular material. And it's possible that somebody didn't select a date. So this could be a null value as well. So what I want to do is I want to say, okay, well, if I've got a date, then let's go ahead and set that date in. And in order to do the filter change, we actually need to provide a specific format. So I'm going to use the format function from datefns that I've brought in, and I'm going to format the date accordingly. So I need to do a year, a month, and a day. Otherwise, let's just set it to null. So that's my ng-on-init method. And then I also need to define this required on parent model change method. And remember, this is when the parent model, so the filter up above the floating filter, when that value is changed, I'm going to get notified as the child, if you will, that something has changed. And so I'm going to get a parent model instance, and that parent model is going to be the date filter model. And you can get, in here is where you've got this kind of some of the typing around this for the date filter model. And now that I've got the date filter model, I'm going to check for a value. I'm going to say, okay, if the parent model has a value on it, or if it's not, if it's a truthy, then I need to, again, I'm kind of have to do a little bit of parsing. And this is specific around dates between whatever I'm using Angular material. So between that and going into the floating filter. So again, I'm going to have to use that date parse I'm going to use parse from datefns, and I'm basically going to get the date that the user entered. So I'm going to do parent model, and I'm going to get the date that they entered. And then I'm going to tell it that I know that this comes in as a specific value. And you can see here, I said, use the parse function, and then we're going to use this string as the parse string, because this is what the value, the parent model date from format is. Otherwise, just use a new date of today. If I don't get a parent model value, I'm going to reset the date control to nothing. Just, give me 1 sec. I'm just going to set that value to an empty string. Okay. All right, so now that I've set that value, I didn't actually set the date here. So then I'm going to do this date control. I'm going to set the value. And then into the date control itself, this is now going into the date control that is my form control for my material input. Again, I've got to do some formatting. So I'm going to format it using ISO, and I'm going to provide that date. And then I don't want to emit any events out of the set value. So that way we don't get any sort of triggering or recursion or anything. So we're going to set emit event to false. Okay, so that was kind of the first step. Next thing I need to do is kind of do our registration. So I've got this all here. Hopefully, I never actually extended up here. I should have implemented these. Let's do that just to make sure we got everything right. So I need to implement the iFloating filter. And I'm also going to, there's also, I think, another class like, iFloating or iFloating filter Angular comp or something like that. And that just extends these interfaces, but I'm going to extend these myself rather than using that. So that way I get an opportunity to specify that generic like we did before. So now I'm going to do AG framework component, and I'm going to specify the params object. And I've got my custom date filter params object. And what do we got here? AG init is missing. Oh, here we go. AgInit. Good, good, good. I'm glad I did that. So now we are meeting that code contract. Good, let's close that. This was all done for us. I don't think we need to do any styles. We need to come over into here. I've got my date filter component there, but I also need to define it in my AgGrid module. And then over here, I've got my framework components. And I need to come down into my framework components. I set this to a string, and I'm probably just going to call this date filter. Let me see, what did I call it before? Yeah, I just called it date filter. Date filter, and then this is my date filter component. All right. And now I can use that date filter in my date of order. So I've got my floating filter here. And so now I want to say floating filter, is it floating filter component? Yes, it is. And I'm going to say the floating filter component is the date filter. All right. Let's save that. I got all of that done. I think we're good. I registered it. We implemented our interfaces. We're getting the params, we're setting that. That looks good. Let's give it a try. Let's see what happens. Good eye on the on-init to AgInit there. I certainly just kind of typed that pretty fast. So here's my filter. Let's see if it works. Let's go to 2019, November 11th, and there we go. Indeed, it works. And then I should be able to test this. Kind of going on a limb here, but if I change this, and let's just change this to like the 15th, notice that this changed right there, right? So that's that on parent model changed event got triggered, right? So now when I change the value in the parent component or the parent filter, I'm changing that value down into my custom filter so it knows about it. And so now that got updated with the right value, and I can see that the 15th is selected. All right, if you have any questions, throw those in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll keep moving along. The next one we're going to look at is the header component. So we could define a custom header per column, or we could define a custom header for all columns. And what we want to do is we're going to build a custom header that uses material icons for sorting. So for whatever reason, we don't want to use the material grid theme. I want to write my own header. This is what my UX team has told me to do. And so I need to implement a custom header for my grid that uses these icons. So we're going to create a new component that uses the icons to display links for sorting the grid. As almost always, we're going to implement the AgInit lifecycle method to access the column's display name as well as the enable sorting property. And we're going to use that to determine whether sorting is enabled or not on that column. We're also going to use is sort ascending, is sort descending, is sort none methods that are exposed in the column property of the iHeader params object that I'm given to determine the current sorting state of a column. Then we're going to use the set sort method to update the current sorting of the grid based on what the user clicks on in the header. And finally, we also need to register our component. The only change here when it comes to registering a header for use in our grid is we actually need to register it with a special name. So we can't just call it, when we do framework components, we can't just call it header, my header, some header. I actually have to use this AG column header name. And this is a special, they prefix it with AG. In theory, you're not going to use that prefix. And this is where I can register a custom header component for all of the columns. And so that is something that we're going to be doing. Let me show you the demo for this. So I think what I'm going to do, we've got 24 minutes remaining. I may skip, just so everybody knows, I may skip the exercise for this so we can get to the editor. But I want to walk you through what this header looks like. And so that way you have kind of an understanding is if you need to build a custom header component, this is how you're going to do it. So here's my header, and these are my mat icons, and I can clear the sorting if I want. And what the exercise would have had you do, and if you want to do this on your own, I put that, the PDF, remember I gave you guys a copy of that. So what I was going to have you do is another responsibility of yours as an implementer of a custom header component is you got to implement the menu, right? So if there's a filter on this column, there should be a little icon that shows up with a menu link that opens the menu to filter, right? I mean, if I come back to our filter, I'm talking about this little doohickey, right? So you can see that I did not do that in this header component. And that's something that the exercise has you do. So if after we go through this and you want to get a little hands-on with a header component, feel free to do the exercise. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to skip that. But I do want to show you the header component, right? So I've got my up, my down, my clear sort. I also know whether it's sorted or not based on the params. So we're going to start by using this iHeader Angular component. And this is starting to look familiar. I've got an iHeader interface. Here's my AG framework component. And then I've got an iHeader params generic that I specify for that. Or this is written for, this is already defined for us. If we need to override the params, then we would implement these two interfaces ourselves. Here's what the iHeader interface looks like. There is a refresh method that is required. And this gets the header to refresh. So it gets called whenever the column definitions are updated so that you know to re-render the header. Here's what my template looks like. I wanted to wrap things in a header div. I think I did some flexbox styling. I'm going to display the name, the header name, if you will. And then if sorting is enabled, then I'm going to display some links to do the sorting. And I'm going to know if sorting is enabled or disabled based on what the user, the person using my component specifies in the column definition. If sortable is false, then I don't want to display these sorting links. I don't want to spend too much time looking at these, but basically I've got a bunch of links. I could have used buttons. I'm not sure why I chose an anchor tag, but basically if I'm sorting descending, I want to toggle that arrow from like up to down. So if we come back here, oops. So I want to kind of just toggle these. I'm just using ngIf basically to change the display of that. So if I'm going descending or if it's none, that's kind of my default, then I'm going to have this material icon and I'm going to call on sort and say that I want to sort ascending. The next one should look very familiar. It's just the inverse. If it's sorted ascending, then we're going to invoke onsort with descending. And this is the cancel button. And I'm just going to send in an empty string to clear the sorting. I've got some properties to track things like the name, whether it's enabled. And then there's my params object that I get in my AG init method. Speaking of which, there's my AG init method. There's my params object that I get. I'm going to store off those params so I can use those in the template. And I'm going to keep track of the params object itself so I have it down the road. Here's my refresh method. Remember, this is required by the iHeader interface. And here I'm going to update the header params and such because the column definition object has changed. Again, we saw this previously. I could just return false and AG grid would just destroy this component and recreate it if I don't want to deal with this refresh. But I'm using Angular. I've got change detection. I'm good to go. I'm just going to return true and tell AG grid, hey, I'll take care of refreshing the header when necessary. Here are some methods. Basically just got a couple of helper methods. I probably could have just used the params object directly in the template. maybe just to make the template a little shorter, I just got some methods here that are using the column object that is part of the params object. And I'm just checking the sorting, whether it's ascending, descending, or set to none. And then here's my onSort. I'm going to get onSort. I'm going to specify a string, ascending, descending, or nothing. There's my mouse event. And then I'm going to invoke the setSort method on our params object, give it a direction. And I believe this event.shift key, I'd have to double check the docs, but I think this has to do with the multi-column sort. Okay, and of course we need to register it. And we need to register it. Note here that I use this special name. Remember I said I can't just call this anything when I register it by name. I've got to use AG-column header. And this tells AG-grid that I want to use a custom header component. And of course, we bind that down into AG-grid Angular and set the framework components. Here's the exercise. I'll throw a link in the chat if you are up for it or if you want to keep the link and try it. Again, what I wanted to have you do in this exercise was, I'm just afraid that we may run out of time. Let me see. What do you think, Jason? I've got one more component that I want to get to. We've got a half hour left.
You want
to stop and do it, or should we just keep going?
Let's leave it to the attendees. Raise your hand if you guys want to do the exercise, and leave it down if you want to continue on.
Sure.
Well,
Andy says continue. I'm getting a lot of continues.
Okay. Yeah, we got.
I figured as much. That's what I was thinking. Let's just. Do
you want to answer Ed's question really quick before you move on?
Oh, sure. Sorry if this went over my head, and no, you don't need to apologize, Ed. It's all good. What's a use case for having the parent filter and the floating filter and connecting them? Good question. The use case is it's just a UI benefit. It's just a kind of a short way to have the date filter right there. So it's just just an ability to have that. And the fact that it extends it is how all floating filters work. You can write a custom filter itself and not use a floating filter if you want to. I just chose to do a floating filter, so. It seems like you'd only want your custom ones shown and not worry about implementing unparalleled change. Yeah, sure. Yeah, if you're not using the floating filter functionality, then you would just create a new date filter component that's not a floating filter. And then you don't have to worry about notifying or the parent changing and stuff. Yep. So this was just, I chose to do a floating filter. That's really the end result is, if that's, let's say that's what the task was, then that's what we would do. But you can definitely write a custom filter and use something like material or whatever. Alex says, continue. I want to see the styles, even if it's skimmed through. Yeah, we might be able to do that actually, Alex. So I think this exercise is a good one. I suggest you grab the PDF. I'll put a link in at the end of the day here. You spend a couple minutes and give it a shot. And let me do this for you as well, because I don't have an actual solution. So for those of you that want to do the exercise, here is, can I just copy Sandbox link? Here is a link to the solution. So if you get stuck on the exercise, grab that link in the chat, and you can use that if you get stuck and you need to look at the solution. That's the solution that I wrote for the exercise. Okay. let's do a date editor. This is a beautiful like old church from the 1200s or something in Scotland. Anyways, okay, so date editor. I'm going to show you a demo first. So here's my date editor. And here, if I double click on this, I'm going to open up my material like date filter, right? Or not date filter, but date picker. And you'll see that I had to do a little bit of work to get it to like trigger immediately. So it didn't just like show an input. And then let's just change it to the 1st. So now it's the 1st. Let's change it to December 31st. Now it's December 31st. So this is a nice, much better UI than, because otherwise I don't think the, here you can kind of see it doesn't like it if you don't choose a value. Otherwise I think the date, there is a date, I think, isn't there a date editor? Correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's a date editor that's built in, or maybe it's enterprise only. I don't know. But this is another solution for building a date editor. So let's take a look at the code. You're going to see a lot of repetition here, and this is a good thing, certainly when we're learning stuff. But we're going to see we've got an iCell editor Angular component interface. It's going to extend iCell editor, and it's going to extend AG framework component. And there's the iCell editor param. So starting to look really familiar, and that's a good thing. Here's my iCell editor. I'm required to write a method called getValue. And what's going to happen is I'm going to tell AG Grid when I'm done editing, right? So it's going to start editing. I get to do whatever I want in terms of this interface or however I want to edit, right? And then I'm going to basically, through the params object, I'm going to say, hey, I'm all done. The user's all done editing the cell, and then it's going to go and invoke this getValue and get the value to actually store as the value inside of that cell. And of course, that value could then go through its usual process with a cell formatter and a cell renderer. I'm going to use the material date picker as we saw. I think I needed to put, no, I don't know if no, it's not here. Here's just your form control. And I'm going to use that to get the value changes. So here's my form control for my date picker. Right, this is what I needed to do. So in order to get the date picker to launch right away into that, to have it show right away. So as soon as I start editing, immediately I wanted it to kind of trigger the event of showing the date picker and not just show an input element or something. So I needed to use the viewChild query here and get access to the actual date picker component. And this static true is no longer required if you're doing Angular version 9 and higher, I think. So my date picker property is a mat date picker class instance. So a little nuance there, but I just want to tell you that's why I had to do this in this particular case. All right, like we've done before, we are going to implement my iCell editor Angular comp. Notice I'm not doing the iEditor or whatever it was, because in this case, I'm not providing any custom params interface. So I can just go with the default. And here is my params. I'm going to store that. I got an ArcGIS subscription to deal with unsubscribing. And then here's the value, which is a date object that comes out of the date picker. Again, here's our Init Lifecycle method. Should look familiar. There's my params. I'm going to store my params, and then I'm going to set value on the date control on my form control and provide the value. And then I don't want to emit an event that the value has changed. So I'm going to use the options argument and set emit event to false. So this is going to update the date control with the value from AG Grid. So whatever the value is, this is going to set it into my date picker. So that way, when I double click this, it's got December 31st selected. I need to know about that value so that way I can kind of choose the right value to display, set the value down into my date picker. And then here's my ng on init lifecycle method. This is where we're going to start, we're going to use the value changes observable and subscribe to it. And if we get an error, looks like here I just chose to log out an error. A next notification, I'm going to get that value, and I'm going to set the value to the value property inside of my component. And then here's, remember I was saying we need to tell AGGrid that I'm done, right? And so what I want to do is, in this particular use case, as soon as you select a date in the date picker, I'm good. I don't want to do anything else. So I'm going to tell AGGrid, hey, stop editing, right? And stop editing is going to trigger AGGrid to kind of do a whole bunch of things, kind of like, get rid of the editing event or whatever and kind of display it. It invokes get value on my component, and then it puts that value inside of that cell. I've got a couple, here's that little bit of I wouldn't call it a hack by any means, but here's that little bit of nuance where I needed to use the after view init lifecycle method at Angular to basically open the date picker initially. I'm cleaning up my subscription, and then here's my required get value, and I'm just returning this dot value. And there it is. I don't know why I had it in there twice. Here we go. We're going to register. So we're going to register our component. And here we register our component just like we've been doing all along. I'm going to go into my actual component that's going to use my date picker. And I'm going to register it with the framework components here by name. There's a reference to my date editor component. And then for the cell editor, I'm going to set that equal to that name of date editor. And of course, we bind that down into the AGGrid Angular component. We've got 20 minutes left. This exercise is a good one, but we also have an opportunity to take a look at some of the styling. And I kind of had a feeling that the component exercises were going to take some time. Let's see, Jason, what are we thinking? Should we do the exercise?
Again, let's put it up to a vote.
What do the people's want?
Yep. Raise your hand if you want to do this exercise. If you want to continue on to styling, go ahead. And a lot of people are saying continue and styles in the chat. I guess at this point in time, before we continue on, I want to give anybody who does have questions some chances to ask any questions about the editor component. All right. Looks like we're continuing.
Cool. Yeah, it gets to be a little repetitive there, I know, but I think it's not a bad thing. Certainly when you're learning, it's like, okay, I do this, I do this, I do this. But you can see how I like that it's also, if you will, when I'm building these different custom components, I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I usually know, okay, I'm gonna have to do an interface. Some require this method, some require that method. I'm almost always gonna use AG-init and go from there. All right, let's back up to the styling. Okay, we've got about 15 minutes, and I want to respect everybody's time, but I want to give you a quick snapshot of styling with AGGrid, and I'm going to skip around a little bit just so I can give you a high-level overview, the best that I can in the time that we have remaining. There's a couple of things that we should know is when it comes to styling in AGGrid, there's different levels of styling, and so all the way down at the smallest level. This is very similar to like CSS, right? So we've got inline styles on an HTML element, right? It has the highest specificity, is directly on the element, probably not great in terms of reusability, probably not recommended for an entire application to use just inline styling. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it. I don't think it's probably the way to go. If that's what you're doing, you can certainly do that. But similarly, AGGrid has different levels. So I can style things at a cell level. I could style at a row level. I could style at a grid level. And within each of those levels, I can style using like an inline style tag. So I can say on this cell, I want, or on every cell, I want this style. Or every cell in this column, I want this style. I can also put a class, right? So I could kind of bring it up a little bit of a level and say, okay, I want to put a class on every cell in this column. I can also dynamically add and remove classes. So I can use the cell class property. That'll dynamically add classes. I can also use the cell class rules property to dynamically add and remove. And I want to hit on this because if you start to get into styling this, you might get kind of tripped up on this. And this also applies to styling of rows. So if I want to kind of toggle a style on a row, I have to use this either row class rules or cell class rules property on my column definition, or wherever it's either column definition or for rows. For rows, I think it goes on the actual AG Angular or AG grid Angular component. But the cell class rules is an object akin to like ng class, where you have an object with a class and then like a predicate function that gets invoked and determines. And that predicate function, whether it's true or false, will add or remove either the style or the class. And so if you're using just cell class, it only ever adds classes and never removes classes. And the same applies to rows. So here is an example of my cell styling, where I'm literally saying on every cell in this column, add these styles. Not very reusable, a little bit of a blunt force method, but it's something I can do. I can also give an array of cell classes to apply to all of these cells in a column. And I can also have a predicate function that returns a class or an array of classes that are added to the cells and never removed. Once it gets an error class, you can't take it off unless you use cell class rules. So here is where we would use cell class rules. And we're going to say, I want to have either a negative or positive class on it based on that value. And so this will add and remove this based on the Boolean value that's returned from this predicate function. Same is true for the positive class. It'll be added or removed. Again, just to kind of hit that home, if I use cell class and I add one of these classes, it's never removed because that's just the way cell class behaves. And that also applies to rows. I'm not sure what I was going to do here. So we could take a look at a demo real quick. So if we go into styling and cells, I'm styling all of these cells. And then this is using the cell class rules. So I don't remember if I go negative maybe. Yeah. So I'm adding and removing a class on this element. So if I come over into my DOM inspector, I should see this cell class negative on there. And then don't move around too much on me. And then if I put this to 100, we can see that the cell class negative class was removed and the cell value negative was removed and cell value positive was added. If I'm just using the cell class or the cell style, remember that's not the case. I've got an exercise for you if you want to go through this later. Similarly, rows have a very similar functionality. There's a beautiful picture of the Alps, by the way, I took last fall hiking. So I can also put styles on a row. Again, it's kind of that blunt force methodology, row style, and give it an object. I can also have a callback function that'll conditionally apply styles using the get row style callback function. Or I can have a row class that sets classes for all of the rows. I can have a get row class callback to conditionally add classes, but not remove. And then I can use the row class rules to add and remove classes conditionally. So here's some of these different methods. Here's my get row class kind of callback method. I could just hard code a row class if I want to, or an array of row classes. I can have some rules. That's that object that has the class is the key, the value is a predicate function to conditionally add and remove class rules. And then there's that blunt force methodology where I just say, hey, I want all the rows to look like this. Here's that row class rules object. I've got those class names as properties, and the value of the property is a predicate function that's going to add or remove the class. And then here's that get row class where I'm going to also do some logic and return a class that's applied. We can also style rows. Let's see, row styling demo. We got 10 minutes left. Row styling. Okay. Don't remember what was in my row styling demo. Let's skip this and get into the theme stuff. I'll just make it easier. I mentioned this maybe this morning, but basically I've got several themes that I can use with AG-Grid. There's the Ballin theme, it's the most dense, Alpine, a nice modern but less dense theme, material, use the material spec, least dense, and both Balm and Alpine come with dark mode options. But here's what I want to teach you, is I want to teach you real quick about customizing themes. I want to show you that there's a couple of cool things that we can do with themes. So using a couple of different things. First, I can use theme parameters. So with SCSS, rather than just including the theme straight out of like the dist directory of the node modules folder, I can actually include a mix-in, and I could customize the look and feel based on some theme parameters. And I'll show you what those look like. I can also use CSS variables to customize primarily the color of things in the grid, foreground color, background color, border color, I believe. I can also use CSS rules to target things like even rows, odd rows. And then finally, there's also additional mix-ins and functions that are provided by AG-Grid to get access to some of the computed values like colors and some other things. I'll show you these real quickly in the couple of minutes we have left. So here you can see, first of all, that I'm not using the CSS file anymore. I'm bringing in this AG-Grid SCSS file. And then I'm bringing in this AG theme Alpine mixin. And then I'm going to define the AG theme Alpine class. And then I'm going to include the AG theme Alpine mixin, right? So you kind of think of this as like, this is how they're generating the theme. Like when you use just the CSS file, they're basically doing this for you and dumped out the CSS. But what I can do is I can use some parameters into this mixin, and I can override some parameters, and these parameters kind of almost like CSS, like cascade down, right? And so if I don't want any borders on my grid, on my cells, on my rows, I can just set borders to false. Or if I want the Alpine active color, so like when I select a row, that's like what's called like an active state, I can set that to deep pink if I want. I can change the padding throughout the entire grid by just setting grid size. So maybe Alpine, I like it, but it's a little, like it's not quite dense enough for me, or maybe I want a little more spacing. I can modify the basically like a factor of spacing throughout the entire application. I can also use CSS variables. For example, I can set background color, foreground color, and border color and override those that are defined in my CSS. And so these will actually override, because I think they're using CSS variables for these. So you can override in a particular use case, or maybe in a row or something like this where you want to change the colors. And then I can also just target some of the CSS rules. And so I could target the header, for example. And you can find these mostly just by inspecting the elements in AG-Grid. and say, oh, AG header, perfect, or row even, perfect, or AG row, great. I want to style all the rows this way. That's one way to do it as well. And what I want to show you is I can actually use, I can kind of grab computed values. So I can grab that parameter that was provided to the mixin and get the background color if I want. And this will get just the value, or I can include a mixin that they've given me called AG color property. And I'm going to use the Alpine active color value to set the border bottom color CSS selector or whatever property, I guess. Yeah. Attribute, not sure. So that's kind of a high level overview of theming and customizing the grid. So there's a documentation, of course, on AG Grid's website where you can get more information about what are all the parameters. They don't actually have great documentation, in my opinion, around the CSS variables. I kind of had to dig into their source code to look at some of that. Here's another one. I'm doing AG row even here and setting that. There's some more examples. Yeah, so that's kind of, I even went a little fast on that. So that's kind of a high level overview of the styling. I've got a bunch of demos you can take a look at. So if you actually go in the application to the styles.scss file. So what you want to do is just comment these out. Let's just do it. Let's comment those out. We're going to bring this in. And let's change this. It's kind of hard to see. Let's change this to deep pink. I've got a grid size of 4 pixels. Let's save that. See what happens. Yeah, I did something wrong. AG theme Alpine. Oh, don't I still need one of these? I don't remember. Let's see. What am I doing wrong here? Oh, this is the Ballin theme. That's why. We need to find one with Alpine. Looks like in the editor component. So components editor. There we go. So now there's my custom theme with my blanched almond, my deep pink. You know, if I kind of, you can see that it's bringing in some of these. I can increase the entire size of the grid. So let's say 6 pixels. We should see kind of all the spacing increase. There it goes. I think that's kind of the default for Alpine. Or if I really need more spacing, I can do that, kind of use that. So certainly a lot of tools that they provide out of the box in order to customize the look and feel. There's a couple of no-nos. Don't do anything that changes positions when it comes to doing almost any styling in your grid. AG Grid, one of the reasons why it's performant, or one of the techniques that they use is, you'll notice like this isn't just a table underneath the hood, right? And they're doing some pretty complex like transforms. If you get in here, I think maybe like on the row and stuff, they've got like transforms and all this kind of stuff. So if you start messing with positioning, you can certainly use display. So if you want to do like display flex, you know, flex direction row or column, you know, maybe you want to display a bunch of stuff in a column for this particular like column for customer name. You know, you want to have, you know, last name, first name, or you can do that. But I'm pretty sure that one of the big no-nos and gotchas is like, don't start doing like positioning absolute or relative or anything like that, because AG Grid, you're going to start to see it's not going to work. You're going to get some weird behavior, and they've got some good docs around this. So if you come into themes, they'll talk about some of the different things that you can do in customizing the theme. And if you come down into there's a section in here on the docs where they basically say don't mess with certain stuff. I think here. So avoid breaking. So don't mess with position overflow and pointer events, basically. And may break functionality. So that's kind of a warning. Okay, cool. I'm going to end there. We got 1 minute left. Real quick, let me give you my last slide. Thanks for those of you that are sticking it out here towards the end. I certainly hope this has been incredibly valuable for you. As I mentioned in the beginning, and if you were a little late, I started a kind of a really cool initiative to make it easy for people to learn in public. I'm a strong advocate for learning in public. And I created a website called lookout.dev. It makes it really easy to go and share something that you learned. So for example, if you know, we got a couple more. So Alex Okrushko works at Google for the Firebase team. This is really cool. He shared this today, and he talked about how he can get better typing when extracting the keys and entries from an object or an enum with TypeScript. So you can see that he kind of did an overview, and then we got some code examples here, and then you can always add a comment. So it's a really cool way to just kind of share what you learn and learn in public. I think there's a couple more that I've written in here that might have like some do's and don'ts. Here's an example of like using an SVG for a favicon. I didn't learn this. I know it sounds crazy until like this summer at a conference called Cascaded JS. And so I talk about, kind of what it is, a little description about what I learned. I've got some instructions on what to do and maybe what to consider. You can also add why and avoid. And then I've got a code example. Say, hey, if you're using a favicon, just use an SVG and don't do what I used to do, which was I used to use Sketch to output like 8 different sizes for mobile and tablet and desktop and iPhone and iOS and all of this crazy stuff. And so I learned that. And so I wrote a quick lookout and shared that with everybody. And so it's a great way to kind of learn in public. So it's free to join. Check it out. Join us. I would love to see what you come up with and what you share with people. And I certainly encourage you to learn in public. I think it has some really unique advantages to just being able to learn, of course, but also to contribute back to the community, to engage, and to be a part of kind of the developer ecosystem. And with that, that's my plug, if you will. I'm not making any money off it. It's just something I'm passionate about. I want to say thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference. If you're doing workshops tomorrow or the conference on Thursday and Friday, have a great time. Thank you so much. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Brian_Love. My DMs are open. If you have any questions about AG Grid, you can ping me. I also have my own consulting company. So if you need some help with an Angular project, React, Node, these kinds of things, Gatsby, happy to get engaged with you on that. And thanks again. I'm going to put real quick before I forget, I'm going to grab one more time a link to the PDF for those of you that maybe missed it. So that way, if you want to do some of the exercises, drive.
While Brian's doing that, I want to take the time to thank all of you guys for attending. These conferences and workshops only happen because you guys are willing to attend and spend your time with us. Really want to thank Brian. It's been really enjoyable spending the day with him today. He's presented some really good information on AG Grid. I've really enjoyed it. And then just so you guys are aware, you guys will get a link that will be available for 7 days that will give you the ability to rewatch the sessions that you've attended today. You'll get a link with a password that'll allow you to do that. They'll be good for 7 days. After that, it'll be at least 2 weeks before they get everything edited and up on YouTube. But the plan is for the free sessions, they're going to edit them and get a link up on YouTube for you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Have a great evening, night, morning, whatever it is for you. Really enjoyed today. Oh, real quick, if you have any more questions, I'm happy to stick around and ask questions. But again, want to be respectful of your time. So thank you very much. Ed has a questions about dark mode. And I don't know if I know the answer to your question. I know that they just, like if you go on the AG Grid website, they don't provide a dark mode for material. And I don't know, I don't have an answer as to why that is. I don't know if material, I don't know if it supports it in a different way, because I don't think they're using, I think they followed the material spec, but I don't think it's like they're using Angular material or material, or, you know, there's a material for Vue. I mean, I don't think they're using any of those libraries. I think they kind of wrote the theme based on the Google material language spec. So I don't know why they don't have it dark, and maybe that's something that they'll come out with in a future release. So. All right, cool. Any other questions?
If you guys want to talk to Brian, feel free to raise your hand. You can ask him questions and talk to him directly.
Seems like we're winding down.
Looks like it.
I mean, a GDE for Angular. Good question, Alex. Actually, I'm on a podcast called The Angular Show, which is also part of kind of ng-conf. And we actually did a show, I think it was about 2 or 3 months ago. It's hard to keep track of time these days, but I think it was 2 or 3 months ago. And we talked a little bit about the GDE process. And I think we each kind of shared a little bit about our process into that. But in general, I have enjoyed being a part of the program. It's a great group of people from really all around the world. I think there's about 150 of us or so, or 100, I'm not sure. And it's just wonderful to be able to engage with people, ask questions. We do a monthly sync up with the Google team and the Angular team at Google, mostly the DevRel team, so folks like Stephen Fluin and such, and get some inside look into things. It's an opportunity also for us to provide feedback. It's really important because I think to some extent, if you work on a framework, you don't actually use the framework a lot. You're more of a framework developer rather than a framework user. So like Angular doesn't use a framework. I mean, it only has like 3 dependencies, right? Like TypeScript, zones, TSLib, and RxJS. So 4, I guess. And so it's a really good opportunity for them to get feedback from the community. Of course, they've been doing that through things like the roadmap, RFCs, certainly GitHub issues, conferences, but it's another way for us to kind of engage with them. And so they gotta see what's going on in our world. So it's been a pleasant journey. And Ed wants the PDF from this morning. Yeah, it's been a pleasant journey, and I've really enjoyed being part of the group. And if you're interested in learning more about kind of what the GDE program is and maybe how you become a GDE, I would point you to the Angular show. So if you go to ng.show, we talked about GDEs. Okay, maybe it was more than a month ago. I'm sorry. Okay, it was June. It's not that, right? That's a couple months ago. So there's an episode here, Alex. I don't know. Can I just throw a link in here you go. And you can subscribe to the podcast. That would actually help us, honestly, in terms of just knowing kind of the impact we're having on the community. And so we talk about getting into the program, why we joined, how we've benefited from it and through our careers, and kind of all of that. And so it's a fun listen, so you can check that out. Ed wants the PDFs from this morning. Let me do that for you, Ed. Let me grab that file open, getting started. Oops, come on. Export to PDF. give it a minute. It's uploading. Getting started with AGGrid. Get link. Copy. All right, there you go. I'm glad you enjoy it, Ed. We it's funny, we do this podcast. I mean, we spend at least 2 hours a week doing the podcast. And then I also kind of help with some of the logistics around it and such. So I probably spend 2 to 3 hours a week of my, personal time, if you will, kind of doing the podcast. And so we actually kind of wanted to make it a little more than just like a straight tech, and there's nothing wrong with a straight tech podcast where it's just, just real, deep dive into tech or something. I mean, I love those things too. But we wanted to have some fun. And so it's really fun. Jennifer, Frosty, and myself, we just get to hang out. We get to learn something. We get to, maybe teach something. We get to know people in the community. We try to make it representative of the community in terms of diversity and inclusivity, and we try to have fun. And so we do. It's a good mix of, I like it. It's a good mix of on topic and wildly off topic, because we do some stuff and we'll just be like, we'll see kind of what happens. Hopefully that went well. And we've got some positive feedback. I think the last episode is a pretty, we've done a couple episodes where we just talk about, I think the last episode that we just released is the meta episode, where we just talked about why we do it, right? So why the Angular show? But we've talked about we did a beautiful, I thought a really great job of a 6-part series on state management. We've got a 4-part series coming out on the RxJS operators. So we're going to look at creation operators, transformation operators. I can't remember the other two, creation, transformation. Either way, we're going to do a 4-part dive into RxJS operators. We're going to do another series on forms, talk about template forms, reactive forms, and NgX formally, and just kind of get some people together and talk about forms, because we're probably all doing it. And so we've been trying to be a little diligent to some extent about doing some of these kind of series, which hopefully have been well received. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to sign off, and Jason is already overstayed.
You know what? I enjoy this.
Today, Jason?
It's been awesome. I've really enjoyed this, Brian, and the Angular show is so much fun to listen to. You guys are fun. So
is it? I hope so. Sometimes I help with the show notes, like the notes that go out, like in the emails, and I'll forget to write them up immediately. And I'll have to go back and listen to the show myself. And a couple of times, so I'm listening to the show and I'm literally just giggling. And my wife is like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm listening to myself." I mean, I think I'm funny to some extent, but Frosty and Jennifer and the three of us, we have a great time. So.
No, you can tell that you guys have a great time, and it's just something good to have on in the background, when you're dealing with meetings or whatever. Don't tell people that you should pay attention at meetings, maybe.
Ben says, operators, operators, operators. Sounds like Steve Ballmer's developers chant. Nice. Yeah, it's hard sometimes to do a podcast without showing. So, we don't show any code, right? It's not a YouTube channel or something. And so it can be difficult sometimes when we get into some of these tech stuff, but we already had Jan Nicholas on, and we talked about the creation operators. And then we've got Jen, forget her last name. Her handle is Nerdsome. We've got her, and Zach DeRose came on recently, and we did the transformation operators. I think we're going to do the filter operators, and then the join and multicasting operators, something like that. I don't know. Maybe we'll go to 5. We'll see how it goes. So, operator mono, nice. All right, good. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to sign off. Probably go drink some tea. I don't usually talk this much. I'll throw in a last pitch. If you're interested in joining me another day this week, it's a paid workshop. But if you go on ng-conf website, I'm doing an advanced RxJS workshop. Speaking of RxJS, so not sure where it is. So here. And so I'm going to take you through subjects. We'll talk about observable, observer. We'll look at all of the subjects: async subject, replay subject, subject, behavior subject, WebSocket subject, if you've never used that. We'll talk about the multicasting operators. We'll do a deep dive into error handling, things like retry when, retry, throw when, catch error, of course, the error notification. We'll look at building a custom operator. So kind of what we did today, I guess, maybe, if you will, for building custom components, but we'll build our own custom operators. And then we'll take a look at testing. So we'll take a look at testing observables. We'll learn about marble testing, hot versus cold. We'll wire that all up with the test scheduler, an expect observable. And then we'll kind of circle back around to some of our custom operators. And then and this is where marble testing really shines. It really probably shouldn't be used almost at all for testing your components that use RxJS, in my opinion, but we'll use it for testing those custom operators that we built. So that way we can get some tests around those. So it should be a fun time. So if you're interested in joining me, that's on Wednesday. So you can come up here and purchase a ticket. I think it's $4.99 for a full day of training. It is going to be a lot of good content. So if you want to take your RxJS to the next level, join me and we're going to do it.
That sounds awesome.
Cool.